A leather journal sits in a bottom drawer for 2 months before anyone finds it. Brown cover, soft from handling. Pages filled with numbers nobody else would think to write down. Rainfall totals, worm counts, soil temperature, recorded by hand, every spring, for 23 years. The man who wrote it is already dead by the time his daughter finds it. And what's written on the last page will end up outlasting a bank, a dealership, and every person in this story who ever doubted her. Her name is Margaret Holcombe. In March of 1963, she is 20 years old. She has her father's hands before she has anything else of his. Cracked at the knuckles, strong enough to pull a calf into the world, gentle enough to press a seedling into soft ground without snapping the stem. Frank Holcombe taught her to drive a tractor at 12, taught her to weld at 14, taught her something most farmers twice her age never learn: how to read soil the way you'd read a face you loved. Slowly, carefully, looking for what's underneath. Frank farmed 240 acres of dryland wheat and grain sorghum west of Russell, Kansas, for 26 years. Quiet man, never owed $1 he couldn't cover by harvest. He raised Margaret alone after her mother died of pneumonia in 1951, when Margaret was 8. There's a ritual the two of them had. Every fall, after the wheat came off, they'd walk the stubble fields together at dusk, scattering rye and clover seed by hand into ground that had just given everything it had. The neighbors called it wasted seed. Frank never answered them. He just kept walking the rows with his daughter, a bucket on each hip, saying almost nothing. Margaret didn't know yet that those evening walks were the most important lessons of her life. Before the funeral, before the dealership, before any of it, there was an ordinary Thursday in February. Frank up before light, boots already on, coffee going cold on the windowsill because he never remembered to drink it while it was hot. Margaret in the kitchen at 16, then 18, then 20, learning to make biscuits the way her mother used to, though she'd never tasted her mother's to compare. They didn't talk much, Frank and Margaret. They didn't need to. He'd come in at dusk covered in dust, wash his hands at the kitchen sink, sit down to a plate she'd kept warm, and that was the whole conversation some nights. The scrape of forks, the radio low in the corner, the wind outside doing what western Kansas wind always does. There was a particular Thursday Margaret would remember for the rest of her life, though nothing happened in it worth remembering. That was the whole point. Frank came in early for once, before dark, and the two of them sat on the porch steps while he taught her to read a cloud bank building in the west, the kind that might bring rain and might bring nothing at all. He didn't explain it like a lesson. He just talked, the way he always did, about pressure and color and the smell the air gets right before it breaks. Margaret didn't write any of it down. She didn't think she'd need to. On Sundays he'd stand at the kitchen window with his coffee, looking out at the same 240 acres he'd looked at 10,000 mornings before, and he'd smile. Not because the work was easy. Margaret would understand that part later. He smiled because the work was his. She thought that life would go on being ordinary for a long time yet. The previous Friday morning, Frank Holcombe collapsed in the barn. Massive stroke. Dead before the ambulance left town. He was 51 years old. Margaret found him. There's no gentle way to write that sentence, so it stays short. She found her father on the barn floor, and the rest of that Friday does not exist in her memory as a sequence of events, only as fragments. A neighbor's truck. A telephone receiver she couldn't put down fast enough. The unbearable normalcy of the chickens still needing to be fed that evening, as if the world hadn't just ended. The funeral was small. Dryland farmers, mostly. Men who shook her hand too firmly and told her Frank was a good man, like she didn't know that better than anyone alive. 3 days later, she still hadn't slept through a single one of them. Here is what Frank Holcombe left behind: 240 acres of wheat and sorghum ground, a farmhouse with a roof that leaked over the back bedroom, and no tractor that ran. His only machine, a 1951 Farmall M, had thrown its crankshaft 2 months before he died. He'd been planning to rebuild it that spring. He never got the chance. Margaret had $1,100, 2 summers of wages from the grain elevator in town, kept folded in an envelope she'd never told her father about, meant for nothing in particular until the day it became meant for everything. On a Tuesday afternoon, still in the same clothes she'd worn for 3 days, Margaret drove into Russell. There was only one equipment dealer within 30 miles. Dennison's John Deere. A showroom with 6 tractors gleaming under fluorescent light, and a man behind the desk named Roy Dennison, 46 years old, pressed shirt, the kind of handshake that announced itself before you'd even agreed to shake it. Margaret walked in wearing her father's work jacket, 2 sizes too big, dirt still under her fingernails from a week she hadn't had time to wash off. Roy Dennison looked up from his desk, looked her over once, and laughed. Not a quiet laugh. The kind that carries across a showroom floor and makes every man in the building turn to see who's being humiliated. Margaret didn't know yet that this laugh would still be ringing in Roy Dennison's ears 23 years later, on a night when there'd be nothing left of his showroom to laugh from. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" Roy said, still smiling from his own joke. "I need a tractor. Something I can run 240 acres with. What do you have used?" Roy leaned back in his chair. "I heard about your daddy. Sorry for your loss. Frank was a good customer." "Thank you. So what do you have? What are you planning to do with the farm?" "Farm it." His smile got wider. The kind of smile that isn't really a smile. "Farm it by yourself?" "Sweetheart, you're 20 years old. You can't run 240 acres alone. That's a man's operation. Your daddy ran that place by himself for years, and it nearly broke him. Why don't you lease the ground to one of the neighbors? Harold Brewer's been expanding. He'd give you a fair price. Or better yet, sell it. Buy yourself a nice little house in town. You're a pretty girl. You'll find a husband. Let him worry about the farming." Margaret looked at his clean hands, his pressed shirt. She thought about her father's hands, cracked and calloused, strong enough to pull a calf, gentle enough to replant a seedling. "Mr. Dennison, do you have a used tractor for sale or not?" Roy sighed, the way you'd sigh at a child who won't listen to reason. "I've got a 1958 John Deere 730. $12,000. Fine machine. I can finance it, 10% down, 7 years at 9%. Payment's about $160 a month." Margaret did the math standing right there in the showroom. $160 a month. $1,920 a year. Over 7 years, she'd pay close to $15,000 for a $12,000 tractor. $3,000 in interest on money she didn't have. "That's more than I can spend. That's what equipment costs, sweetheart. Farming isn't cheap. You need capital to compete." "I'm not trying to compete. I'm trying to survive." Roy stood, walked around the desk, and put his hand on her shoulder, the way a father might touch a confused daughter. "Margaret, listen to me. I knew your daddy. Good man. But he was stubborn. Farmed with old equipment, never upgraded, never expanded. He left you 240 acres and a broken tractor. That's not a legacy. That's a burden. The smartest thing you can do is sell that land, take the money, and start a life." Margaret stepped back, and his hand fell from her shoulder. "My father taught me everything I know. And one thing he taught me is that the people who tell you what you can't do are usually the ones afraid you'll prove them wrong." She turned and walked out. Behind her, she heard Roy say something to his mechanic. She only caught 2 words. "Little girl." This is the part of the story where most retellings rush ahead to the auction, to the bargain tractors, to the satisfying montage of a woman proving a man wrong. We're going to slow down instead, because what happened in the 2 weeks after that walkout is the part Margaret almost never tells anyone, and it has nothing to do with Roy Dennison at all. 2 weeks later, Margaret heard about an estate auction 40 miles east in Ellsworth County. Old equipment, the kind that sells cheap because nobody's looking for what's being sold. She drove out on a Saturday morning with everything she had, $1,100, folded in that same envelope. 2 tractors stood overlooked at the edge of the lot. A 1949 Farmall M, a 1953 Farmall Super M, both faded red, both showing their age, both exactly the machines Margaret had grown up working on at her father's side. Same bones, same blood. The 1949 M went first. The auctioneer asked $1,000. Silence. Asked $500. Margaret raised her hand. Sold for $400. The Super M went next. Margaret bid $500. A man in the back bid $550. Margaret bid $600. Silence. Sold. $1,000 for 2 tractors. She had $100 left to her name. An older man walked up to her afterward. Tom Weber, 300 acres near Ellsworth, watching her the whole time with something Margaret hadn't seen on a man's face in 2 weeks. "Those are solid tractors, young lady. You know how to work on them. I rebuilt my father's Farmall twice before I was 18. Tom nodded slowly. Not pity, not amusement. Recognition, the way one farmer looks at another. "Your father taught you well." "He did. Then you'll be just fine." She borrowed a neighbor's flatbed, hauled both tractors home, and spent 3 weeks in her father's workshop rebuilding a clutch, hydraulic seals, a fuel pump, an electrical system, using her father's tools, following notes he'd left behind in a battered repair manual on the shelf. By the middle of April, both tractors ran. She planted 120 acres of winter wheat her father had already seeded before he died, and put the rest into grain sorghum. Up before dawn, working until she couldn't see her own hands. The neighbors watched, talked, shook their heads. Asterisk, that Holcombe girl is going to kill herself out there. She'll be done by fall, guaranteed. Asterisk. In June, Roy Dennison drove out. Found Margaret under the Super M, replacing a hydraulic line. I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm here as a friend of your father's. She slid out, grease on her face, wrench in her hand. What do you need? Just want to make sure you're okay out here. People are worried about you. People are talking about me. There's a difference. Those old Farmalls aren't going to last, Margaret. Parts are going to be hard to find. You're going to have a breakdown at the worst possible time. They'll last. I know how to take care of them. Your daddy thought the same thing. And his tractor threw a crankshaft. That landed. Margaret felt it in her chest. But she didn't flinch. My father's tractor had 200,000 hours on it. These have half that. I'll take my chances. He shook his head and drove away. Margaret went back under the tractor. Her hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Harvest came in September. 28 bushels an acre. Not great, but solid for dry land Kansas in a dry year. She sold everything, paid her taxes, set aside seed money for spring, and had $4,200 left. She put every dollar in the bank. And then came November. The harvest was done. The field sat empty under a sky that had nothing left to give. The days got short, and the wind came down off the high plains the way it does out there. Cold, steady, relentless, the kind of wind that doesn't howl so much as it simply never stops. Margaret was alone in that farmhouse for the first time since her father died, and the silence was louder than anything she had ever heard. She sat at the kitchen table one evening with her bank statement and a pencil. $4,200. That was everything. One bad year, one drought, one piece of equipment she couldn't fix in time, and she'd be finished. The numbers didn't lie, and for the first time since she'd bought those two Farmalls, Margaret Holcombe thought seriously about Roy Dennison's words. Asterisk, sell it. Buy a house in town. Let someone else handle it. Asterisk. The next morning, she drove into Russell. She told herself she was going to the feed store. She did not drive to the feed store. She parked across the street from Dennison's John Deere, left the engine running, watched farmers walk in and out, men with clean boots and new hats, men who belonged in that building in a way she suspected she never would. She thought about how easy it would be. Walk in, tell Roy she'd changed her mind, let someone lease the ground. The payments would come in steady, once a year, and she could get a job in town, and she could stop waking up at 4 in the morning wondering whether the Super M would make it through one more season. Her hand found the door handle, and that's when she saw her own reflection in the side mirror. Her father's jacket, her father's hands, or close enough. Dirt under the nails, calluses on the palm. She thought about Frank Holcombe driving that Farmall M through 30 Kansas summers without a single complaint. She thought about him coming home covered in dust, washing his hands at the kitchen sink, sitting down to dinner like it was the most natural thing in the world a man could do. She thought about the way he used to stand at that window on Sunday mornings and smile, not because the work was easy, but because the work was his. Margaret took her hand off the door handle, put the truck in gear, drove home. She never told anyone about that morning, not for 45 years. The only reason this part of the story exists at all is because she said it herself, decades later, sitting at that same kitchen table. Asterisk, everyone thinks I never doubted myself. That's not true. I doubted myself every single day for the first 5 years. The difference between quitting and not quitting isn't confidence. It's just deciding to go home and do the work anyway. Asterisk. In December, she decided to finally clean out her father's workshop. Not sweep the floor, actually clean it. Every drawer, every shelf, every box she'd been avoiding because the room still smelled like him. Oil and sawdust and old coffee. In the bottom drawer of his workbench, under a pile of receipts, she found a leather journal. Brown cover, soft from handling. It wasn't a diary. It was a soil record. 23 years of it. Rainfall, soil temperature, organic matter, worm counts, which cover crops he'd planted each fall, and what they'd done to the ground the following spring. Diagrams of a 7-year rotation nobody else in the county was using: wheat, sorghum, fallow, cover crop, wheat, sorghum, cover crop again. Margaret had helped him seed that rye and clover into the stubble every single fall of her life. The neighbors had mocked it as wasted seed. Frank never once explained himself. He just kept walking the rows. Now she understood why. While every neighbor around him had spent 2 decades mining their soil, pulling nutrients out, year after year, putting nothing back, Frank had spent those same 2 decades quietly building his. The cover crops added nitrogen. The fallow years let moisture accumulate. The rotation kept disease from taking hold. Every field on the Holcombe farm held more organic matter, better structure, and deeper topsoil than anything comparable for miles. He had measured it, documented it, never told a soul, because Frank Holcombe wasn't a man who explained himself to people who weren't going to understand anyway. On the last page, in handwriting shakier than the rest, probably written in his final weeks, there was a note. Asterisk Maggie, if you're reading this, I hope you kept the farm. The land is better than it looks. I've been building it for you. Don't let anyone tell you it's just dirt. It's 23 years of work, and it's ready. Trust the soil. It won't let you down. Asterisk. Margaret sat on the workshop floor and cried for an hour. Then she dried her face, carried the journal to the kitchen table, and started studying. What happened over the next 17 years didn't look like a turning point while it was happening. It looked like nothing at all. That's the part nobody tells you about patience. It doesn't announce itself. From 1963 to 1980, Margaret farmed those 240 acres with the same 2 Farmalls she'd bought at auction for $1,000. She followed her father's rotation. She planted cover crops every fall while her neighbors laughed, the same way they'd laughed at Frank. She lived below her means, saved aggressively, never took on $1 of debt. The results came slowly. By the early 1970s, her wheat yields were running 10 to 15% above the county average. In the drought of 1974, when half the county's wheat failed outright, her fields produced 22 bushels an acre while her neighbors averaged 11. People noticed. Not with respect, not yet. With confusion. How was the Holcombe girl outproducing operations with twice her equipment? The answer was sitting in a leather journal on her kitchen table. Nobody asked her, because in 1974, nobody thought to ask a woman about agronomy. Roy Dennison was thriving through the 70s, riding the agricultural boom. Farmers buying bigger tractors, taking bigger loans, expanding into more acres than they'd ever dreamed of farming. Once a year, like clockwork, he'd stop by Margaret's place to find her still farming with those old Farmalls. They're running fine, she told him each time. 20 years old because I take care of them. Same way I take care of my soil. By 1980, Margaret had $92,000 in the bank. 17 years of careful living, 0 debt. She owned her 240 acres outright, her equipment outright. She owed nothing to anyone alive. Her neighbors, meanwhile, were leveraged to the sky. New tractors at 12%, new land at peak prices, operating loans stacked on equipment loans stacked on land loans. Everyone was confident. Everyone was certain the good times were permanent. Margaret read the farm magazines, watched the interest rates climb, and she remembered a note her father had written in the margin of that journal back in 1958. Asterisk, the soil doesn't lie. It gives back exactly what you put in, nothing more, nothing less. Debt is the opposite. It takes back more than you borrowed, every single time. Asterisk. Then 1981 arrived, and the world her neighbors had built came apart at the seams. Interest rates spiked past 20%. Grain prices crashed. Land values collapsed. Farmers who'd borrowed to expand woke up owing more than everything they owned was worth. Russell County was devastated. Between 1982 and 1987, 43 farms in the county went to foreclosure. Families that had worked the same ground for generations, gone in a single auction. Some Saturdays, there were 2. Roy Dennison's dealership was bleeding out along with everyone else, his boom year loans going bad faster than he could chase them. The showroom that once held 6 gleaming John Deeres sat half empty. Margaret watched her neighbors fall, one after another. Harold Brewer, the man Roy had once told her to lease her land to, in 1984. Gene Whitfield, who'd farmed beside the Holcombes since Margaret was a girl, in 1985. Each time a farm went to auction, Margaret showed up. Never to gloat. She showed up because she remembered Tom Weber looking at her with recognition instead of pity all those years ago, and because now she could be the one extending that same recognition. By 1988, cash in hand, no bank, no loan, 3 separate purchases over 5 years, Margaret Holcombe owned 600 acres. All paid for. All hers. She was 45 years old. It was a Thursday evening in October of 1986 when Roy Dennison's dealership finally closed for good. 34 years of business, finished in an afternoon. That evening, Margaret was in her workshop replacing a water pump on the Super M when she heard a truck pull into the yard. Roy, sitting behind the wheel, engine still running, staring at nothing. She walked out and stood by his window. "Roy, are you all right?" He turned. His eyes were red. "I closed the dealership today. I heard. I'm sorry." He laughed, a short, broken sound. "You're sorry? I told you to sell your farm. Called you a little girl behind your back. And you're sorry that I lost my business. Losing something you built is painful, no matter who you are." He was quiet a long while. "How many acres do you own now?" 600. He shook his head slowly. "I pushed debt on every farmer in this county for 20 years. Made good money doing it. Now most of them are gone. Lost their farms because of loans I helped them sign." "Nobody forced them to sign, Roy." "No, but I made it easy. I made it sound smart. And I laughed at the one person in this county who was actually doing it right." He looked at her. "You were right about everything, and I was wrong about everything. I wasn't right about everything. I was just careful. My father taught me the only thing that can ever take your farm away from you is the bank, so don't give the bank that power. Frank was the smartest farmer I ever knew. I just didn't realize it until tonight." He'd appreciate hearing that. Roy started his truck. "I owe you a real apology. Not just for today, for every time I drove out here and told you that you were doing it wrong. You were the only one doing it right. Thank you, Roy. Those Farmalls. Still running. Every single day." He shook his head. $8,000 for 2 tractors. Best investment anyone in this county ever made. He drove away. Margaret stood in the yard and watched his taillights disappear down the county road, and she did not feel victory. She felt sadness. Because Roy Dennison wasn't a bad man. He was a man who believed what the industry told him, and the industry had been wrong the whole time. Margaret farmed for 45 years, until 2008. She expanded to 840 acres along the way, always with cash, never with a mortgage. Every piece of equipment came from an auction lot and a rebuild in her father's workshop. The 1949 Farmall M ran until 1991, 42 years of service. It sits in her barn today, a quiet monument to what patience can build. The Super M ran until 2004, 51 years and 3 full engine rebuilds. She cried the day she parked it for the last time, the way you'd cry saying goodbye to a friend who had carried you through everything. Her father's soil journal became her own Bible. When university soil scientists tested her ground in 2002, her topsoil measured nearly 7 inches deep against a county average of 4. "What did you do differently?" they asked her. "I listened to my father." When she retired, she leased her acreage to a young couple who'd been working as hired hands on a corporate operation. Fair rent, first option to buy, and one piece of advice. Take care of the soil, and the soil will take care of everything else. She gave them the journal, too. Roy Dennison died in 2001 at 84. Margaret went to the funeral, sat in the back, said nothing. Afterward, his son found her. "You're Margaret Holcombe." "I am. My father talked about you, especially near the end. Said you were the best farmer he ever met, and the worst customer he ever had." Margaret smiled. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about me." She is 83 years old now. She still lives in the farmhouse her father built. Some evenings, she takes the journal down and reads it the way you'd read letters from someone you loved. What her father gave her was never really the land. It was the belief that a 20-year-old woman with 2 junk Farmalls and $11 to her name could build something that would still be standing decades after the people who doubted her were gone. "My father spent 23 years building that ground," she says now. "He put in more than he took out, every single year. And the land remembered. When the crisis came and everyone else's soil was exhausted, mine was rich. That's not luck. That's just math. You get back what you put in." She pauses. "Same thing's true of people, by the way. Same thing's true of everything. Somewhere right now, somebody is being told they're too young, too small, the wrong gender, the wrong background, holding the wrong equipment to do what they're trying to do. Somebody is being laughed at for choosing the careful way over the fast way. Frank Holcombe never lived to see what his daughter built, but he left her a journal that said trust the soil, and she did, for 45 years, long after he was gone. If this one stayed with you, subscribe for more of these. The forgotten people who built rural America one careful season at a time. Tell me in the comments, has someone ever laughed at you for doing it the slow way, and were you right in the end? And send this to the one person you know who needs to hear that nobody's permission was ever required. The land remembers everything you put into it. Make sure it's worth remembering.